To keep our episodes focused on our experts and the value that they bring to these conversations, we're supplementing them with some deep dives. These additional episodes may consist of conversations between Tim and Alyssa that deserve to be heard in full, or may highlight even more insight from our expert guests.
You're about to hear Alyssa and Tim explore his in-depth experience with the Boy Scouts of America and its long-standing ties to the LDS Church. But first, Tim shares an important update about recent legal developments with the Boy Scouts of America regarding abuse cases, information that may be helpful to those directly impacted.
I've been representing clients against the Boy Scouts of America for almost 25 years. In 2018, I discovered through an article I read that the Boy Scouts were contemplating filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And I understood immediately what their strategy was going to be because I've been involved in other child sexual abuse bankruptcies filed by other organizations, primarily the Catholic Church. And their objective, the Boy Scouts' objective, was to wipe out all of their sexual abuse liabilities by running it through bankruptcy court. And I knew, based on my experience, that there were potentially millions of victims who would be stripped of their legal rights when this happened. And so I undertook to inform them. I enlisted two other law firms that I'd worked with. Within months, we had 18,000 men hire us to represent them. The Boy Scouts filed their bankruptcy plan in February of 2020. And when the claims bar deadline was reached in November of 2020, 84,000 survivors had filed claims based upon their sex abuse victimization and scouting. The case was complex and it dragged on for years. And it resulted in the confirmation of a plan of reorganization for the Boy Scouts of America in April of 2023. The financial and other terms of the bankruptcy plan are too complex to go into here. There was approximately $2.4 billion that was put up by insurance companies and by various scouting organizations, sponsoring organizations, and so forth. There's also additional insurance. The total amount of funds available to pay claims isn't known. It could be anywhere from $2.4 billion to as high as $8 or $10 billion. There was an appeal. That appeal dragged on for about 18 months. The Third Circuit Federal Court of Appeals issued its opinion in early May of this year. I believe that is the end of the legal process for those challenging the bankruptcy plan. I did not support the plan. I urged survivors not to support the plan, to vote against it, but nevertheless, the plan was confirmed over those objections. If you were abused in scouting, you may still have a path to justice if you did not file a claim in the Boy Scouts bankruptcy, particularly in the context of the Mormon Church. If you were abused in scouting, you should contact us immediately because you still have a potential based upon the individual facts and circumstances of your case to pursue justice and hold the Mormon Church accountable. I'll give you just one example, and there are many examples. One of them is that the plan recognizes that your claim is only barred if you were abused in the context of scouting. So if you were abused by a scout leader, but it was not in connection with a scouting-related event, perhaps he was a fellow home teacher, or maybe this happened in young men's or in some other LDS context, your claim is not barred by the bankruptcy, and you may well have a path to justice and compensation. Again, it's hard, really impossible for me to describe specifically. It really depends upon the individual facts and circumstances of your case. And the best thing is to contact us and let us do a full evaluation of your case.
So growing up in the church, I have very distinct memories of being told I should never even date someone unless they had served a mission or planned to serve a mission, and they needed to have their Eagle Scout. And so the importance of scouting within the church, in my mind, was kind of a prerequisite to righteousness. Even though, to someone who's listening, they might think, what does the Boy Scouts have to do with Mormonism? But the two were, in my, as I was growing up, they were so closely linked, as the girls would go to Young Women's and learn to make spaghetti, and the boys would go to Boy Scouts and learn to tie knots and learn their duty to God. And from when you started to interface with the church and learn about its relationship with the Boy Scouts, if you could just lay out for us, and even for me, because I don't know the history, how the church became so entangled with the Boy Scouts of America.
You are so correct. And it's a very interesting story. I have probably spent somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20,000 hours working, thinking, reading, studying, representing, interviewing survivors of sexual abuse in the Boy Scouts of America. And a significant number of them were abused in the context of a Mormon church-sponsored scout troop. So let's go back to the beginning. The Boy Scouts were recognized by an act of Congress in 1916. And the Boy Scouts of America was at that time the only youth organization that was given a charter by an act of Congress. And what that meant was that they had the exclusive legal right to use the name Boy Scouts of America, that they were entitled to patent protection, copyright protection for all the indicia that we associate with the Boy Scouts of America, the fleur-de-lis, the eagle and everything. And that was huge because with those legal rights and to control those intellectual assets, the Boy Scouts of America essentially extinguished competitive scouting organizations, of which there were dozens, but they couldn't compete with that. But the alliance between this newly created organization called the Boy Scouts of America and the Mormon Church goes back to the very beginning. At the time they withdrew a few years ago from the Boy Scouts of America, 40% of all scout troops in the United States were sponsored by the Mormon Church. It's important to understand that Boy Scout program was the exclusive youth program for young men in the Mormon Church.
So I grew up in Young Women's, and there was a point where my family thought maybe I would join Girl Scouts, and they were like, no, you have Young Women's, which is modeled in many ways after Boy Scouts. There's multiple levels you can go through. You get ribbons, you get necklaces, you have a big project at the end you have to complete that takes a number of hours. So it's like a photocarbon copy of what scouting is, but just meant for women to learn to be wives and mothers.
They saw scouting as an extension of the church. They infused scouting with the Mormon religion. Absolute requirement is you must believe in God. So no atheists. There were also no black people permitted, no girls, no female scout leaders. Some of that came later with the Blazers program, and there were moms that got involved. But this was a male-only program. It was a private club. They asserted the right to exclude anybody that they wanted to on any basis, and this was before the civil rights laws of the 1950s and 60s, which challenged some of that. But even as late as the 1980s, the Boy Scouts, with the Mormon Church at their back, litigated the issue of gay scoutmaster all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found on behalf of the Boy Scouts that, it's a private organization, and private organizations can exclude women, gays, whomever they want.
How are they able to do that they got this government charter? Is that just like an intellectual property charter? Or did they get money from the government while also claiming to be a private organization?
Well, simply having the right to the name Boy Scouts of America was good as gold. because the Boy Scouts of America was first, or maybe I would say first and foremost, but almost as important, it was a marketing organization. The Boy Scouts of America understood that they were selling a product, and the product was an image. And the image was, wholesomeness. It was mom, apple pie, the American flag, patriotism. So they wrapped themselves in all of these, traditional American virtues and owned them. So they were able to persuade millions and millions of parents that this was a trustworthy, honorable, virtuous, patriotic organization. And the Boy Scouts themselves in the early years, and it went on for many years afterwards, actually disparaged parents. They saw at the time working parents who were struggling just to put food on the table. Kids were not being supervised. They were getting into trouble, juvenile delinquency, and so forth. And their message was, entrust your boys to us, and we will mold them. And we can do a better job of it than you can, parents.
It's like so wild when you consider everything that came out as a result of that messaging.
Well, and that was also why it was essential for them to keep the secret of the rampant sexual abuse of children in the organization a secret. It's why when they became aware of sexual abuse, they never reported it to police. And the Boy Scouts discovered almost before their inception that their program was rife with pedophiles, that it was porous to infiltration by child molesters. And, if you build it, they will come. If you create a permissive, open, unquestioning system, trust but don't verify, trust but don't ask questions, trust but don't ever scrutinize. Just like the Mormon Church, the Boy Scouts of America was that, perhaps even more so.
In some of the stories I've heard, it's so egregious to hear just how much they knew. Like, it would be a story where there's someone who's a serial offender, a serial child abuser, who's embedded with the Boy Scouts. They find out and they move him to a different troop. Or they move him, or they say, sorry, you can't be in Arkansas anymore. And then he goes north. And there's just the level to which there's never any cutoff point. There's never any reporting. There's never even the institutional knowledge doesn't travel from point A to point B to say, hey, we're not going to report it, but at least we're going to keep it from continuing to happen within the Boy Scouts. Like there's just no accountability, or there's nothing.
A big part of that is that the history, the truth was buried. It was hidden. What I discovered through my years of research and digging into, well, I'll get to what the press later called the perversion files in the Boy Scouts, but they called them the confidential files. That process actually began as early as 1916. But let's talk about the structure of the organization first. You had a national organization and it had a charter, and under that charter, it was authorized to create bylaws and rules, and it did. And under the charter, they were to go out and they were to, in all of the states, to create what became to be known as local councils. There were, at one time, over 400 different scout councils, and they were able to operate because they paid a charter agreement fee to the Boy Scouts of America, and that's where much of the money came in. The money also came in through membership. Boys' parents would pay it at that, it was a quarter, 50 cents a year. But in the Mormon Church, because it was the exclusive youth activity, and what you've just alluded to, every boy is coerced one way or the other by his parents or the bishop or just peer pressure. Whether he wants to be in scouting or not, he's going to be in scouting, which is why LDS scout troops were generally regarded within the greater scouting community as inferior because there were so many kids that didn't want to be there.
Yeah, anecdotally, I always heard growing up that the real Boy Scouts didn't like the Mormon Boy Scouts because the church had twisted the program enough that it almost was a different thing than just the mainstream.
And it was a different thing. But this is important to know. When you have 40% of what eventually became, I think at their height, 7 million registered boys and adults in the program a year. That's a massive amount of money. And the Mormon Church would make the point, we have 2 million, 3 million registered Scout members, and they don't pay, we pay. The presidency pays. They would send somebody, a general authority or maybe a first or second counselor to the president, would personally make the trip. In the 1960s, they moved to Irving, Texas, their headquarters. So the church would send a leader with this check for millions of dollars down there to give it to them. And it was like, who's your daddy? Money enabled the Mormon Church to exert massive influence over the organization. And they did so culturally. They did so through their opposition. And I'll give you some examples. The Boy Scouts of America have been, insanely protective of their symbols and the fleur-de-lis. And, there were attempts to poach on some of those Boy Scouts of America symbols. Those entities would get slapped with a cease and desist order before you could blink an eye. And yet you would see on the fleur-de-lis of the uniforms worn by Mormon Church, you would see the Angel Moroni. Wait a minute. Nobody else could put a cross or a Star of David on there.
Context for anyone who's listening, the Angel Moroni is the angel that led Joseph Smith to discover the gold plates in the side of a hill. And the Angel Moroni is on top of most temples, and it's basically the symbol for the Mormon Church.
And you also only had to look at the composition, of the National Board of Directors of the Boy Scouts of America. I mean, dozens. I think there are 55 now, but I think at one time there were 150 or more. And they would have their pictures and everything. And it was like, wait a minute, that's a general authority. He's a general authority. That's a general authority. It was just, it was dominated by LDS influence. And there were tensions because the LDS Church did exert so much power.
If you could walk us through, how did this lead into the uncovering of the massive amounts of sexual abuse that were happening in relation to these two organizations?
Okay. So I said that they began tracking. They would have little index cards at BSA headquarters. And when they would get a report from a council about somebody that was involved in the molestation of boys, the policy was they were to basically fill out a form and send it in, and Boy Scouts National would fill out a card. And so the idea was that if that person who was removed from scouting tried to rejoin, maybe in a different town, a different state, that they'd be able to cross-check it against their card file and say, oh, he's in our red card file. But that was it. It was a name, and this was early on. So by 1935, and you have to understand, in this country, I think there were 110 million people, much different place. 1935, it's the 25th anniversary of the founding of the Boy Scouts of America. And they hold this gala celebration in New York City. And President Theodore Roosevelt's son, who was a big promoter of Boy Scouts of America, was the speaker. And he was talking about all of the wonderful achievements of the organization in the 25 years of its existence in the United States. And he goes and talks about one of the things they've done is this red card file. Well, the reporters that were there covering this thought that what he was saying was that the Boy Scouts were tracking communists. So there was sort of this uproar because the Communist Party had 1 million members in this country in 1935. And there was a lot of concern about the rise and influence of the Communist Party in the United States. So the chief scout, Dr. West, had to call a press conference the next day to clarify Mr. Roosevelt's remarks about the red card file. And I know about this because I went back and I found this obscure article in the New York Times from 1935 that covered this press event. And in it, Dr. West says, no, we're not tracking communists. What we have found, and he goes on to describe in this sort of stilted language of the time, pedophiles. These are men who are of unsound mind that have abnormal interests in boys. or through their involvement in scouting and around boys, they develop personality traits that render them perverted. I mean, yeah, today we know exactly what he's talking about. He goes on to say that they had been keeping this red card file, and that's what Mr. Roosevelt was referring to, and that they had 2,916 cards, okay? This is in the first 25 years. These are just the ones that where it got communicated to headquarters and they took the action of creating this card. But I got involved in this during the Scott case. It drug on for 4.5, 5 years. There were long periods where nothing was happening. We were waiting for the court to rule on this or that. And I had a lot of time on my hands. So as I was culling newspaper articles and lawsuits from around the country involving the Mormon Church, I was seeing that many of these were arising in the context of scouting. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's how I began to explore this connection between the Boy Scouts, and I went back and read the history and realized, wow, the Mormon Church is the Boy Scouts of America, and the Boy Scouts of America is the Mormon Church. And I came across a book that was written by a reporter named Patrick Boyle. He was a reporter for the Washington Times, and he was covering a civil trial involving a boy who was abused in a scout troop. And in the context of the trial, the plaintiff's lawyers introduced evidence of similar incidents involving scout leaders who had been able to get access to boys, some of whom, and this was common because they were often never reported to the police, they were never arrested. Sometimes if a card was created, they were able to get around it by changing a middle initial or changing the spelling of a name or date of birth. So it was just as easy as anything to just sneak back in, and they did. So Boyle thought to himself, this seems like an interesting book project. He found a lawyer in California named Michael Rothschild who had litigated one of these cases against the Boy Scouts of America. And as plaintiff's lawyers do, you want to know, well, how serious is the negligence here? Have you had similar problems? I'd like to see files on similar cases because it goes to show, that there's a pattern of negligence and that your policies and practices, led to the abuse of my client. And you've known about this for years because you've had complaints, very similar to the complaint that we're bringing. And so the Boy Scouts of America produced a few files and claimed that was all of them. So the lawyer took some depositions and discovered, no, there has to be more files than that. You can tell when something is incomplete. And it's like, so this just started up in 1972, there's no files from before 1972. Well, there were, but, I think some of them were destroyed. I don't know when or what. And so he goes back to the judge, 3 times, and these are called motions to compel, which is judges don't want to get these motions because they expect the lawyers to follow the discovery rules. Judges don't like it when lawyers and parties lie under oath in court filings. So the judge was just furious, and he turned to the Boy Scouts of America's lawyers and said, you're going to produce every file, and you're going to produce it by close of business in 3 days. And they said, but judge, that won't give us enough time to redact the names, the information, and so forth. And he says, I don't give a damn. Turn them over. What got turned over were approximately 1,900 of these confidential files of the Boy Scouts. And Rothschild got them. This is in the mid-1980s. And Boyle went to him and said, you still have those? He says, yeah, they're in my storage room somewhere. Yeah. So he went out and copied them, dozens of file boxes, and he poured through them. And he first wrote a series for the Washington Times newspaper. Very interesting series, but it was, it exposed this system in the Boy Scouts and how they'd known about this and concealed it and a lot of information, but it hadn't really reached a wider audience. Then he wrote this book years ahead of its time. I think it came out in 1991. I came across it during the years I was working on the Scott case, 1996 to 2000, 2001, and it was just very influential. He had the names of perpetrators. He tracked them down. He went to prisons and interviewed them. He knew. You could tell from these files, and I eventually got them, who was running this program. And it was a secret program. People that worked at headquarters in Irving, nobody knew about it except a few executives. And there were a couple executives over time. And when one would retire, then another one would take over. But you could see the timeline. The body of files he had access to covered a roughly 20-year period. So when I was done with the Scott case, I had other cases involving the same perpetrator in the Scott case, Frank Curtis, and he abused many of them because that bishop had put him in one of these wards in charge of their scout program. So he had used that as a pretext to get these boys over at his apartment, supposedly for merit badge training or what have you, and he would sodomize them and do horrible things there in his apartment. So there was a tie-in there. And I also knew that from other cases that there was a Boy Scout Mormon church tie-in that was significant.
I mean, I remember so many times just how often the Boy Scouts growing up, I mean, I had only sisters, but how often I saw that there were activities that were like taking children on extended trips, on overnight trips, on day trips, camping. There was so much camping all the time. So I'm sure that was playing a role in what you were seeing in all these stories, going back to the kind of the architecture and the setup of the Boy Scouts of America, which is that many of the activities are kind of seclusion and then giving opportunities to these people who are in these reports to take advantage of that.
That's exactly right. And, there's so many threads here, and you just pulled on one. Well, many of the features of scouting, like the Mormon Church, it's a uniform system. It's designed by BSA corporate headquarters, and every scout troop is supposed to operate in accordance with these rules and practices. But the reality of scouting is that boys are taken away from their parents, isolated, taken into the woods on 20-mile hikes, sometimes across state lines, and they are removed from people, places, things that could protect them. Instead, they're completely vulnerable out in the woods, sleeping in tents, going places where there are men who are around who have not been registered, not been screened, about whom little is known, and the public and parents believed that it was a safe organization, that it was trustworthy. They didn't know the dirty secret, which was they were sending their boys into what was the largest pedophile ring on earth. That's a fact. And it's borne out by the fact that we were able to determine that there were approximately 60,000 of these perversion files that were created by the Boy Scouts of America. They purged everything prior to 1960. During our 2-year period, it took them that long for 3 executives to go through the files and shred them. And I had deposed these officials, and I asked them, well, what was your criteria? What was the basis on my, well, we figured if the guy was over 80 years old, if he was alive, he probably wasn't a threat any longer. And so they didn't have any criteria. But all the while, they've also got a legal team that's busy handling lawsuits and complaints that are coming in from all over the country and working with their insurance carriers, again, secretly, quietly, trying to resolve these cases. Fast forward, I had hundreds of cases which were either in lawsuit, or we were preparing to file lawsuits, or we were in negotiations, settlement talks with the Boy Scouts of America and their lawyers. And there were other lawyers around the country that also had cases. And so in 2019, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that I read that said the Boy Scouts of America were considering filing bankruptcy. And in February of 2020, they filed bankruptcy.
Was that related to how the Mormon Church had decided to no longer participate in
The Mormon Church didn't withdraw from scouting until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, while the bankruptcy was still in progress. This was a Chapter 11 corporate reorganization bankruptcy, which shouldn't even be allowed for a church or an organization like the Boy Scouts that are essentially trying to default on their obligations to children who were sexually abused. But nevertheless, as the law exists now, they qualified. Now, what happens when a bankruptcy petition like that is filed is the bankruptcy court sets a date by which people who have a claim against the Boy Scouts of America, and this exists in every corporate bankruptcy, you've got to fill out this form and you've got to file it with the bankruptcy court by the deadline. And if you don't, then your claim is barred. You can't bring a lawsuit. When the bankruptcy is filed, all lawsuits are halted under what's called an automatic stay. And so they filed in February of 20. The deadline was November 16th of 20. I had seen that this was coming. And so with some other law firms, we began doing media outreach about it, saying, you know, if you've been abused in scouting, we called ourselves Abused in Scouting. And it was sort of perceived as almost like a civil rights movement. The first month, 10 people contacted us and became our clients. And then by August, I think we had 1,700. By November 16th, my group alone, Abused in Scouting, had 18,000. And the total number of claims that were filed by individuals without attorneys, some with law firms, was about 80,000.
What percentage of that is, I mean, that has to be like, you know, what, 5% of scouts, 10% of scouts were abused?
Well, I think that number, I think that the number is a tiny fraction when you consider that the Boy Scouts said, and this was as of around 2005, that approximately 150 million boys had been involved in scouting during its history. 150 million, okay, had either been registered in scouting or had attended scouting activities. So what I was telling the press, and which I believe to this day, is that there were millions of victims, most of whom were in the graveyard. Also, just because of the difficulty, particularly for males who've been sexually victimized, to admit, and the fear which all sexual abuse survivors have of the legal system, of coming forward, what that means, just all of the, you know, the burden that abuse survivors carry. It's more so for men, and it's triply so for Mormon men coming out of this experience. So I think 80,000 was a massive undercount, and approximately, I think 2,400 clients were abused in LDS Scout wards. We think that was a severe or a complete undercount for the reasons I've just said. I think it's difficult for Mormons to come forward and challenge the church. And if you were abused in a Mormon scouting ward, that's more or less the same. And the Mormon church was drawn into this case because they sponsored and ran and selected the scout masters. The abusers were men from the ward that they put in these positions that were unfit, failed to adequately supervise. So it's not surprising. I knew that there were millions. I didn't know how many would actually come forward in response to the call, but that was a big number.
If you had to say, this is just my own curiosity, of those numbers that you're familiar with, would you say most of those are multi-offense? Like the people who experience the sexual abuse, is it that when they come forward, is it often this happened to me one time in this one setting, or is it this happened to me over a long period of time? Maybe 5 times, 2 times, 3. Does that question make sense? Like, was the fairly serial abuse?
It's varied, and the narratives are some of the most horrifying. The most vile, violent rapists of boys were in this organization. I mean, I'm talking about full-on anal rape of 12, 13, 14-year-old boys. We have scout leaders who would groom boys. There would be multiple incidents of abuse. I've had clients where the abuse went on for years. So yes, there were many, many incidents like that. But there were also incidents where they'd be at some sort of camp jamboree where there were, dozens of other scout troops there. And the boy is sleeping in his tent, and some stranger comes in the middle of the night, some man, and, puts his hand over his mouth and forcibly rapes him. And he's never seen the man before, can't identify him, doesn't know who he was, and is threatened that, he'll kill him if he ever tells. So it was both acquaintance molestation, where it's a trusted individual, you're groomed, and it goes on over a period of time, but it was also stranger situations. So it sort of ran the gamut. There were boys who were abused by multiple scout leaders, sometimes at the same time, at the same location. We had boys who were abused in a scout troop when the family lived in one city and they moved to a different city in a different state, and it happened again with a different scout leader and a different scout troop there. So it's clear that it was just mind-bogglingly, I mean, it was almost the norm. I believe that there are probably untold tens of thousands of men who were sexually abused in the scouting program in the Mormon Church, and they've just determined that that's a secret that they're never going to disclose, and they're going to take it to their graves because of all the reasons we've talked about why you just don't disclose that kind of thing in this church. So the case resulted in a appallingly weak settlement. It was $2.4 billion, which sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but it's not when you're talking about this many men. But in this case, there was massive amounts of insurance, and organizations like the Mormon Church were basically let off with a slap on the hand. And that's true of all of these other sponsoring organizations, of which there were thousands. I mean, Catholic Church, Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, VFW. I mean, just about every church or civic organization in America wanted to have that plaque in their hall that said that they were a proud sponsor of troop such and such. And, they would let their facility be used by this local scout troop for their meetings and so forth. I mean, it was such a far-flung conspiracy. I mean, local police departments, would become aware, but they would cover up for the Boy Scouts of America to conceal and protect the good name of the Boy Scouts of America. So for me, the experience has been very painful because of the way it concluded, which essentially extinguished the rights of the victims to sue other organizations that were at fault for the abuse and yet still got a discharge from responsibility, like the Mormon Church, like all these other sponsoring organizations and the local councils who contributed literally nothing to the $2.4 billion, most of which was contributed by insurance companies, and they only contributed a small fraction of what their exposure was. So a reasonable settlement in this case wouldn't have been $2.4 billion. It would have been closer to $110 billion. And there was money there to pay that. But unfortunately, there were too many that got involved in this case. They have no connection to child sex abuse litigation. And unfortunately, it's one of the ugliest parts of our legal system. I mean, in the business world, sometimes you get too much inventory and, things don't work out. We go into a recession. Bankruptcy was meant to be a way to resolve commercial insolvency in a sort of organized way. In business, you make money and some days you lose money and some days, you go bankrupt. But what about kids? What did they do? What risk did they voluntarily undertake in this system that they can have their legal rights stripped from them? And then this despicable, vile organization that has not done anything meaningful to change the way they operate gets to go back into business. And now it's like, it's even better for pedophiles because now it's called Scouts America and they let girls in. So if you're a pedophile and you're fixated on boys, you've got your choice, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old, body type, race, whatever, you can go in. It's like, but now you've got females too? Ooh, this is interesting. I wasn't so much interested in little boys, but I am interested in little girls. So I guess I'm going to get involved in scouting so I can get access to these 12, 13, 14-year-old girls. And we have clients who were abused, females who were abused in scouting. They tagged along to some scouting event with their older brother, or they had ancillary programs. They had one that was sort of like a ride-along with police, and you got to have a uniform and so forth. So, you'd put a 14, 15-year-old girl in a squad car with a 23-year-old police officer. Oh, what could go wrong? Huge scandals that we've seen coming out of that. And through it all, do you see any action by Congress to say, we're going to rescind this, nothing. So this organization is so powerful and so backed and so entrenched that this bankruptcy has accomplished nothing in terms of child protection. And it will continue, and it is continuing. And I continue to monitor. And every time I see a news article, I tweet it. See, it's happening.
Yeah.
It hasn't gone away. Why? Because the very things that you brought up haven't changed. They're still taking boys out in the woods, away from their parents, no meaningful background checks. I mean, if you work for just about any company, human resources they're going to do a background check on you if you're involved in anything that's slightly sensitive or concerning. And that's not just, it doesn't have a police record. Frequently, most of the time, they don't have police records because they never got reported or turned over. And the way you do a background check is give me references. And then they give you some names. And then you go to those people. And after you interview them, you say, give me the names of 2 people that that know this person. And if they can't do that, then something's wrong.
Yeah. I mean, as a teacher, because I've taught in 3 different states, I've taught in multiple schools. And the amount of things I have to turn over to say, here's my background check, here's my fingerprinting, here's my state ID, and then I have to do a ton of trainings. I have to be interviewed. I have to have a resume. I have to submit references, which they then call. The idea that there is another organization called the Boy Scouts of America where people are working with children in, similar ways in which teachers work with children, working with them, learning their stories, working with them one-on-one, having them in the room with them, all of these things, that there's not one iota of evidence to prove that they have to prove that they are not abusers, or they have to prove they're worth being in the room with the children. And when I compare what you're describing to the vast amount of work I had to do to just, kind of baseline get into the government organization and say, hey, I'm a teacher, I have my licensure, I've completed all the background checks, and you can't even simply hire me, that none of that work has to go into hiring all these people who are going to work with children.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, it's the same idea. Who are you going to put in positions of authority over children? In the case of schools, school districts, they're not perfect.
Yeah,
but they have
problems.
But they have a far better track record, by a long way than the Mormon Church or the Boy Scouts of America. And I would say that the difference is probably in one instance, you have, at least theoretically, accountability. If you're, a school board is elected, and if they drop the ball on this, they can be voted out. They could be sued individually. So there's measures of accountability that they're facing. What accountability does the Mormon Church have? Do they have shareholders? No. Are they responsible to the public? No.
They just hide behind religious freedom,
and it's a private,
tax-free
private club, just like the Boy Scouts of America. Same with the Boy Scouts of America. Who do they answer to?
As you were pursuing the class action lawsuit with the Boy Scouts of America, what role did you see the Mormon Church playing during the lawsuit and thereafter?
Well, first of all, you have to understand within bankruptcy, it's very opaque. 95% of what happens in confidential mediation sessions of which I wasn't privy. So what emerged initially before the court ruled on the final plan, the Mormon Church agreed to put up $250 million, and they wanted to extinguish all of their liabilities, not just for Boy Scout-related abuse within the church, but they wanted immunity from everything for their $250 million. Well, the judge said, rightly so, that's a bridge too far. So you can get immunity for everything Scout-related, but if this was a home teacher who was also the Scout leader, but the abuse took place in some sort of home teaching situation or is it non-Scout related activity, you're not off the hook for that. So the church or the judge carved out the Mormon Church with this respect, but also, other churches that may be in a similar situation. So they took their $250 million back, said, okay, no, we're not going to play, and went about cutting deals, and they got cheap deals. And by this point, I mean, this is what happens in bankruptcy. They're able to stretch things out for so long. People are exhausted. Carrying the weight of this is bad enough. And it's like, I don't care. I'll take the $10,000. I'll take the $6,500. I just want it over with. A lot of folks are in bad shape. We have a lot of times clients who are living on the street. They're lost to drug addiction. I mean, among our 17,000, I think we've been losing at a rate of about 100 to 150 to the Grim Reaper per week. Because so many of these men, they were abused in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They're seniors. My youngest client was 7 years old, and my oldest client was 94, and everything in between. But the great majority, it's consistent with the social study work, which is that they fall in that range, which is roughly 45 to 55, which is when men first disclose. So there's something about that age, the average age of disclosure, and the bulk of those men that came forward in the bankruptcy, probably 75 or 80% were within that age range.
And what ended up happening did the church end up paying any money? Or I guess you said that it's still waiting for that court appeal.
As I understand it, I mean, the church has settled some of those men's claims. I don't know which ones or for how much.
Okay.
Again, the whole process stinks because it's so opaque, shouldn't be allowed to exist in this form. There's tremendous need for reform of the bankruptcy system by Congress, but to think that this Congress is going to protect children, it can't even protect itself. So I don't have an illusion. It's not good news. But I do say this: if you're a parent and you're thinking about putting your child into scouting, don't. And unless you can be there, if you're so determined, then you be there at every meeting, every camp out, and you don't let any adult be alone with your child. But of course, that's not the way parents have used scouting. They've used it as a daycare center, as a babysitting. Not all parents, but to a large extent, that's how they viewed it. It's like, and they thought they were doing something good for the child, getting them outdoors, learning survival skills and scoutcraft and so forth. And a lot of my clients who were abused still have fond memories of their experience in scouting and learned a lot of valuable lessons and attribute a lot of their success as adults to it. And they somehow have compartmentalized this terrible part, which has scarred them, with the good things that they've gotten out of the program. So I've been attacked more viciously by true blue scouters than I have by true blue Mormons because of what I've been saying and doing about child sexual abuse in this organization. I'm an exaggerator, I'm a liar, I'm a church basher, I'm a Boy Scout basher, I'm just a money-grubbing, ambulance-chasing scumbag lawyer. I mean, I save these emails, I should frame them, because they inspire me. But, people believe what they want to believe. They have their own narrative. And, I would no more try and convince, a devout LDS that they're wrong than I would, as somebody that's spent a lifetime in scouting and just never had a negative experience and believed that because their experience was wholesome and positive and they weren't violently raped in a tent when they were 13 years old, then that must have been the experience of everybody else.
Yesterday, as we were talking, you shared that more recently, the church has been updating how they are dealing with these claims. Can you explain the more recent changes the church has made?
Obviously, I'm not on the inside, and all I can tell you is what we're seeing, which is, and some of this is how I've changed too, because as I began doing these cases against the Mormon church, I became so angry and felt that it was my responsibility to do something more than what a lawyer is supposed to do, is represent the interests of his client, but to expose this church to do things provocatively, to force it to change. It was something that gave me a sense of purpose and mission, but it didn't always, I think, serve the best interests of what my clients wanted. And I've come to understand that my role should be to help my client get accountability from the church. And it's not my place to tell my client what that means. It's the client's place. The church has actually, they are willing to dialogue and to oftentimes see if they can demonstrate to our client that they are willing to accept a measure of accountability as expressed by the payment of a sum of money, sometimes an apology. And that's new. So I think that's healing for the client. I think it's also, at the same time, it's easy to blame the system, and the system is very much still in place. And I think people misinterpret what is effective advocacy with venality. And I would ascribe in the past venality to their actions, when in reality they were just zealously representing the interests of their client, which were adverse to the interests of my client. That's the nature of litigation. So it may just be me, but I sense that there has been a shift for the better. And I think it's important for survivors to know that if they do want to come forward, it doesn't mean that they're going to be taking on the church in a 5-year litigation, and everybody's going to know we handle these cases. They're handled privately. The church, says to its members that it has an obligation to make restitution to those it harms. Members do, and I think they've taken to heart that the church as a corporate organization has the same responsibility in appropriate cases. It means that they will defend on legal grounds, but they won't attack the person personally and try and destroy them as a legal tactic. So I think it's important that people know that.
Yeah, I think I think that what you're speaking to is a moral responsibility to ultimately face that, what's in the best interest of your client is to get them all the help you can. And I also think for anyone who has been victimized by the Mormon Church or by members of the Mormon Church or the clergy, it actually is good news that they are willing to, even if it's not fix the problem, because that's not possible, to settle this in a way that could lead to some healing for people who have been victims of sexual abuse. And so I think that for anyone listening, that's really important news and really good news, that there is hope, and that if you wanted to report, there is a way for you to potentially get some help.